If we haven't met yet, my name's Kevin, as Isabella said, and I get to be an assistant pastor here at Elmer Full Gospel, so that's what I do. It's pretty great. I think Josh is taller than me, so I'm going to drop this down. Now Josh will have to come up and pop it back up at the end of the service. Sorry about that. But today I am continuing our series called Born to Win, moving from victim to victor. And we want to do this in every area of our life. This is our third week, so if you missed last week or the week before, I encourage you to find those on our YouTube channel. You can kind of catch up and tie them all together. Last week, I dove a little bit into the story of David and Goliath, which is a very familiar story for most people, honestly, probably in the world, but especially for people in church. And today I'm going to be diving into it a little bit more and pulling out a few more things about what does it look like to be a victim, what does it look like to be a victor, and how can we move from victims to victors in every area of our life. So let's pray together. Jesus, we're grateful. We're grateful. We're grateful for this church. We're grateful to live in a country where we can freely meet. We're grateful for this community of people that worships passionately and leans into you and wants to know you more. And God, I pray with the rest of this service, you would have your way, whether you use me or other people or the words I speak or not. Jesus, please just have your way and let your presence rest on us. Let us feel your presence. May this not just be another message that we come in and listen to and forget about, but let us be transformed this morning, God. Amen. Amen. Last week, I opened by talking about my failures as a fantasy hockey league player. So if you're confused about that, you can find it on the YouTube. But I just wanted to give you an update. So that was last season that I got beat out. But I just wanted to give you an update because this season, this past week was the championship game between me and my nephew, and I beat him. So I'm now the champion. I'm the victor in the Fantasy Hockey League. Thank you, thank you. Maybe I'll bring in the trophy someday, and you guys can all take a look at the amazing trophy that someday I will get. And in case you're feeling bad for my nephew, he won it already. So he's old enough that he will not be offended at me, I'm pretty sure. So in case you're worried about me bullying my nephews, that's not the case. So I'm a victor, and so are you. Why don't you start off, just say, I am born to win. I am born to win. You are. Amen. So again, I'm going to dive into David and Goliath, but I wanted to just, again, reiterate kind of the three foundation verses for me that talk about us being born to win as believers. So you can quickly jot these down if you want to. If you want to try to turn there, that's great, but I'm just going to read through them really quickly. Again, I'm using the ESV translation. So the first verse is Romans 8:37, and it says, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. More than conquerors. More than conquerors. That's who we are. And then the second verse we talked about was 1 John 5, the first part of verse 4. And it says, everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. That is our identity as believers, is that we overcome the world. We can't get away from it. And then 2 Corinthians 2, verse 14 says, thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession. No matter what you're facing, no matter how many times it feels like you've lost, he always, eventually, leads us in triumphal procession. And then it says, through us spreads the fragrance of the knowledge of him everywhere. Knowledge of Jesus smells good. That's a side note. You can write that down. So why don't you say it one more time? I'm born to win. I'm born to win, born to win. So let's turn to 1 Samuel 17, and let's dive into David and Goliath a little bit deeper. So we're going to kind of read through chunks of this passage, and this is similar to what we did last week, kind of read through a passage, jump around with the story a little bit. But again, we're trying to identify who are the victims, what are they like, and how can we identify those mentalities in our own lives. And then what does it look like to be a victor, and how can we grow into being a victor? So this is in the context of Israel battling the Philistines. We have this warrior named Goliath who is clearly not a pushover because of all the Philistines, they chose this guy to be their representative, to be their champion. And he has this challenge, and he basically says, let's have a one-on-one battle. You send your best guy, I will take him on, and whoever wins, the other nation serves them. So that's the challenge that Goliath is putting down. So let's pick it up in verse 3 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. It says, the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So, again, about 9 feet tall. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And in case you don't know how much that is, because I didn't either, it's about 120 pounds. So think about a man walking around with a coat of mail that weighs over 100 pounds. He had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. So that's about 15 pounds just on the tip of his spear. And his shield bearer went before him. So this is a fearsome warrior. He is not a pushover. And after this verse, we see Goliath. He makes this big challenge to the Israelites. The Israelites get scared. They kind of run away. We're not going to dive into that this week, but we're going to jump down to verse 28. But kind of on the way, I want you to just take note of what it says in verse 16. Because in verse 16, it says, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. We're going to dive into that a little bit more later on, but I just want you to note that 40 days. That's a really long time, twice a day, for this Goliath guy to shout at the Israelites. So let's keep walking through. We'll jump to verse 28, and this is after David has volunteered to fight. So David comes on the scene, everybody's scared, and pretty quickly he's like, I'll do it. I'll fight this guy. I bet I could take him. And so this is the reaction to him volunteering to fight. In verse 28, it says, Eliab, who is David's oldest brother, heard when David spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. So David's older brother is not happy about this arrangement. He's not excited. He's not cheering David on. And he even says, he emphasizes the fact that David is a shepherd and he's only got a few sheep. Who did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness with? Who do you think you are? Verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, who's the king, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant, I will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. For he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Don't you just love David here? Like, he keeps getting shut down, you would think, but he doesn't back down. He's like, listen, I'm here. I've killed lions, I've killed bears, and I'm going to kill this Goliath. Here's my first point about victims and victors. Victims mock the courageous. Victors refuse to be silenced. Victims, they mock the courageous. Victors refuse to be silenced. And we see this mocking in a couple of places. First, we see it with David's older brother. And he very much, again, he emphasizes, you are just a shepherd. You just came here so you would see the battle. You're just looking for some entertainment. You're not really here as a warrior. And then we see a similar thing come from King Saul. It's a little bit different, but he emphasizes the fact that David is very young. You're too young to take on Goliath. And you might be wondering, why are they so quick to mock him, to disqualify him, to disregard him, to shut him down? And I think maybe they had some legitimate concerns, maybe. But I think the bigger thing was that David was doing what they should have been doing. David was doing what they should have been doing. We actually see just a few chapters before this, King Saul, he's pretty new to this king business, and he gathers an army and he rescues Israel from an enemy. So he's already done this. King Saul has already been the victor in a previous battle. And then just the chapter before, we see this description of Eliab, David's older brother. And it says, the Bible says that he carried himself like a king. He was very princely and he carried himself really well. And he's in the army. So both of these men, not to mention the rest of the army, both of these men should have been volunteering to end this threat to Israel. But they weren't. They were scared. And so I think when David comes along and he defies Goliath and he volunteers, really they're feeling very insecure in this moment because they recognize in David something that should be in them. And so they mock it and they try to cut it down and they try to disqualify David. And I think this is a really easy thing for us to do. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but you have a friend maybe who has decided they're going to sign up for a gym and start working out. They're going to get serious about getting it to shape. And it can be so easy, can't it, to just cut them down and be like, you know how many people join gyms and quit within a month? It's going to be just like you. And maybe we don't even say it out loud, but that's what we're thinking in our hearts, right? And really what it is we know we probably should get in shape. We should probably get more serious about our health. But it makes us feel uncomfortable because someone else is doing what we wish and we probably should be doing. Or maybe, there's a friend who's working a bit of a dead-end job and they decide they're going to start their own business. And in your heart, you wish you had the guts to do that. But instead of cheering them on, it can be really easy to cut them down and say do you know how many businesses fail in the first 12 months or whatever it is, and it can be very easy to cut people down who are courageous enough to do something that you wish you were doing. Or maybe it's just a friend who's feels convicted about something and has decided, I'm not okay with this in my life anymore. I'm going to get serious about personal growth in this area. And rather than cheering them on, it feels convicting to you. And so you try to hey, it's not that big of a deal. Don't worry about it. Everybody Everybody does that. Everybody gossips, or everybody, lies from time to time, or whatever it is. It can be really easy to try to pull people back to our level. But that's what a victim thinks like. Victims will mock the courageous. I think we can all relate to that to some degree. Like I said, maybe we don't always say it out loud, but I know for me, I've had people who are doing things that I probably should be doing or, wish I had the guts to do. And it can be really easy to cut them down even just in my own heart. But what if we could change that? What if we could adjust the storyline even here? What if Eliab, instead of mocking David, had actually been his greatest supporter? And be like, oh yeah, David, I bet you could. Like, let's go to King Saul right now. I'll help you convince him. I bet you can take him. That would totally change the storyline. And so maybe for us, with the people in our lives that are doing these things, I think the first step towards a victor is cheering on the courageous and joining them. So maybe it's, hey, what gym did you join? I'm going to join. Let's meet there tomorrow morning. I could probably use some exercise. Or maybe it's, the business venture, and it's, hey, I believe in you. I really do. In fact, I'll contribute some money towards your startup costs or whatever it is. And let's keep each other accountable, and let's stop gossiping. Let's stop lying, whatever it is. I think that's the first step towards being a victor, because it does take a level of courage to join someone else's movement and support it and lean into it. But then it takes another level of courage to actually start that movement on your own, like David did. And he very much went against an entire army. All of Israel was scared and wasn't willing to stand up to Goliath. And David was the only one. But you have what it takes, because you were born to win. You were born to be a victor. Each and every one of you in this room, you were born to be a victor. So let's look at our victor. Let's look at David, and let's see how he responds to this mocking. Because I'm telling you, if you start living like a victor, eventually you will have some mocking victims in your life. So let's prepare for that moment, and let's see what David does. First off, to Eliab, it says, David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And so I want you to see that I don't think David here is responding by lashing out and attacking Eliab. I think he could have. He could have been like, Eliab, you're just upset because you're a coward. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't respond in the same way. He just strengthens his own stance. He basically says, I'm sorry that you don't like this, but I'm not backing down. And I think that's the stance that we need to have too sometimes. If people come against us and we know that we are doing what God has called us to do, we know we're doing what is right, we just strengthen our stance and we say, I'm sorry that you are not in favor of this, but I'm not changing my mind. I know who I am. I know who God's made me to be. I know the conviction I feel. I know, the challenge that he's given me. And then David also convinces Saul, because Saul says, you're too young. And David says, well, let me tell you my resume. Let me tell you what I've already done. And again, he's not pointing fingers necessarily to himself. He's saying, God has done this through me. I have been empowered by God. I've killed lions. I've killed bears. Goliath is nothing. And so he really advocates for himself with God that he's able to do this. Because victors refuse to be silenced. They won't go away quietly. They won't be dissuaded or convinced out of it. And I'm really grateful that God gives second chances. Because as I was preparing this, I started recognizing times in my life when I've definitely been a victim. And I've definitely allowed myself to be persuaded out of things that in retrospect were absolutely what God wanted me to do. But you start sharing it a little bit, and then, somebody says a couple negative things, and it can be really easy to just let that shut you down. And I've seen that pattern in my life several times. But I'm really grateful that God won't let you stay a victim forever. If you keep walking with God, he will just keep bringing it back and keep putting it in front of you and keep pushing you towards it until, for me, I finally was like, okay, I'm going to own this. This is what I'm going after. This is what I believe God has called me to. I'm going to go after this. And even if people are negative about it, even if people try to convince me out of it, I'm not going to change my mind. I'm not going to change my mind. And so I just want to say there's grace. If you start recognizing yourself in some of these, God has lots of chances for you. I know he's done that for me. And eventually, you will be a victor. Sometimes it might take a few tries, but victors will not be silenced forever. They won't be denied. They will keep trying, keep fighting, until they get the prize and win the victory. They know that they cannot lose forever. They keep trying. They keep convincing. They will not be silenced. So once again, first point is victims mock the courageous. Victors refuse to be silenced. So let's read on. We're just going to jump down to verse 41. And this is after David has convinced Saul. Saul says, yep, go for it. Probably he's thinking, I really hope you win, because otherwise that's bad news for us, but I don't want to do it. And so in verse 41, we see David and Goliath coming together for battle. It says, and the Philistine, so Goliath, moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. So he's even got a friend. Goliath has brought along his buddy. And when the Philistines looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Because David had his sling, but he also had his shepherd's staff. That's what he came. No swords, no spears, no javelins. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, check out this trash talk. This is like, 2000 BC, 1500 BC? Trash talk has been around a long time. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Wow, let's go. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Goliath, you are in trouble. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. He does not mince his words. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines. I think that's interesting. So David and Goliath are battling, but David says, I'm not just taking you, I'm going to take the entire army of the Philistines. I'm not stopping with just you. So the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. I love David's confidence, and I love that he's already pre-crediting God with the victory. He says, I know I'm going to win, and I know it's not really me. And I love that focus of David. He's not backing down. He's totally confident. It almost sounds arrogant in some ways, but it's because he knows who his God is. Here's my second point. Victims focus on the problem. Victors focus on their God. Victims focus on the problem. Victors focus on their God. And I want you to think back a little bit to the start of the passage that we read, and it has a very detailed description of Goliath. And you might be wondering, how did they know all of that stuff about Goliath? He's an enemy. He dies in the story, so it's not like, how did they know all of this information about Goliath? I would propose it's because they were studying him for 40 days. And they were fixated on him, and they were focused on him. I imagine that the Israelites, they get done from a day of I guess you could call it being in a war, even though there wasn't actually any battle going on. And they're sitting around the campfire, and what are they talking about? They're probably talking about Goliath. How tall do you think that guy is? Oh, I bet he's 8 feet tall. No, definitely 9. 9 feet at least. Did you see that coat of mail that he was wearing? That thing's got to weigh 100 pounds. Yeah, I know, and that spear that he was holding, it's like a weaver's beam. Are you getting the idea? They were so focused on the problem. They were fixated on it. They were rehearsing it over and over and over again. And then we have David. And we can't know for sure exactly what he all knew and didn't know, but to me, it does not sound like David had all the facts. I don't think he knew how tall Goliath was. I don't think he knew that his coat of mail weighed 120 pounds. He probably didn't know all of the details, and he didn't really care. He just said, I know God. And so it doesn't matter if Goliath is 20 feet tall. None of that matters. All that I need to know is who is on my side. Who's fighting with me? That's all I need to know. Everything else is just noise. So when the Israelites were reiterating how terrifying Goliath is, David essentially says, but don't we have God? Have you guys forgotten? We have God. And Saul, he was so focused on how young David was that he didn't consider what God would be able to accomplish through him. Our focus is really important. And our thoughts are really important. It's why the Bible says to take your thoughts captive, which is a really forceful word. The Bible doesn't say, just try to avoid certain thoughts. It says take them captive. Don't let them get away. It's really forceful, and it takes effort. It takes work. Controlling your thoughts is not an easy thing to do, but it is possible. Have you guys ever had a situation in your life that just ate up a lot of brain space? You know what I'm saying? It feels like 90% of your thoughts are centered around some situation or some circumstance that's not going the way that you want it to. And it's just so hard to stop thinking about this problem, right? And I'm guessing everyone can relate to this, especially with relational tensions. If there's you're not getting along with someone or there's some sort of conflict, whether it's at work or at home or family members, and you play the conversations over and over again in your mind. Has anyone done this? Am I the only one who plays these conversations? Yes. Okay, thank you. And in our conversations in our head, we're always right. We always convince them that they need to humble themselves and apologize. We always convince ourselves that we are perfectly logically sound and we have an answer for every possible argument they could have, right? Has that ever helped you? It hasn't helped me. If it's helped you, please let me know. But it's never helped me. I've never come away with that and be like, oh, I feel so much better now. This is great. I can just convince them I'm right, and everything will be great. I've never had that experience. If you have, please let me know, and I can learn from you. I'm sure I can. But I can remember during a season of my life, and I had some relational tension in my life. There was a conflict, and it wasn't really resolved, and I'm one who really likes to resolve tension as quickly as possible. And I like to understand what's going on. And I like to analyze things. And I like to figure it out. I don't know if anybody can relate to that. But I remember specifically there's this one night, and I was, getting ready for bed, and this relational tension kind of came into my brain. And so I started thinking about it, started analyzing it, started playing these conversations in my head, trying to figure it out. And I was kind of doing this as I fell asleep. And I woke up the next morning, and I felt very off. I felt heavy. I felt irritable. I was frustrated. I felt just emotionally and spiritually off and just disconnected from the world. And I was like, wow, that really impacted my day. And so I kind of, I shook it off and I went about my day and it was fine. But then that evening, whenever I was getting ready for bed, again, that same relational tension was there. Nothing had changed in the circumstance. Nothing had gotten better or worse. It hadn't changed at all. And I was tempted to spend all of my mental energy trying to analyze the same problem. Because, of course, maybe this time I'll figure it out, right? That's what we think. Like, maybe if I just spend a little bit more time thinking about it, I'll unlock the key and it'll all make sense. But in this moment, I forced my thoughts into submission. And I said, I am going to take these thoughts captive. They didn't help me last night. They're probably not going to help me tonight. I'm not going to think about this. I'm going to think of something more productive, anything more productive. There's lots of options to think about. And I took my thoughts captive. And I noticed when I woke up the next morning, I did not have that weight on me. I did not feel that same sense of frustration and irritability and just emotional and spiritual disconnection. And I say that just to say our thoughts matter, our focus matters. If we spend all of our time focused on the problem, we will not be able to, we won't give space for God to provide the solution. Because God is a God of solutions. He's got a solution for the problem, but he doesn't always tell you it when you want him to. Have you guys noticed that? You want him to just give it to you right away, and God usually doesn't do that. I'm not sure why. If I ever figured it out, I will let you know. But we need to allow God to work in the waiting, in the tension. And we need to say, God, I really want to just focus on this problem, but I know it's not helpful. Help me control my thoughts. Help me think about something else. Help me focus on you and your ability to work in this situation. Victors focus on God, while victims spend all their times fixated on the problem. And I want you to notice something else that David does in this story too, because this is part of being a victor. It's kind of a side point. But he reminds himself and he reminds King Saul of what God has done through him in the past. And I think this is really important as we step into being a victor too. Remember what God's done in the past. Every single person in this room, if you have walked with God for any length of time, you have at least one story of where God has come through with you. And it can be as simple as your salvation. That's a simple thing, but it's not something to be scoffed at. That's a huge deal. God came through for you. And so David reminds himself and he reminds King Saul, God has come through for me in the past. And that's why I'm so confident that he will do it again. And that's part of what being a victor is about. We need to remember what God has done. So next time you're faced with a tough financial situation, remember when God has come through for you in the past. If there's, maybe you feel bound up by people's expectations of you and you feel like you can't break through, remind yourself of when God has delivered you in the past. He can do it again. If he's done it before, he can do it again. And remembering what God has done in the past needs to be our baseline, our foundation for everything that happens in the future. I've noticed it's very easy, and you see this in the Bible over and over again, but it's very easy to experience a breakthrough or a miracle in your life and say, that was amazing. Like, let's just take financial circumstances as an example. You need $500, and God comes through, and $500 lands in your bank account. That's amazing. That's awesome, and you celebrate it, and it's amazing. And then a year later, you need $500, and you are filled with fear and anxiety and frustration, and you're not quite sure if God's going to come through for you. That's exactly what the Israelites did over and over and over again. But what we need to do is say, I remember when God came through. I remember when God came through, and I know he will do it again. If I can put it this way, our testimonies remove our excuses to give into fear and anxiety. If you're fearful and anxious about something that God has already done in the past, you actually don't have a good excuse for it because you know the goodness of God. You know his faithfulness. We need to remember what God has done. And we need to focus on that. Focus on God. Focus on what he can do. So again, that's my second point. Victims, they focus on the problems. Victors focus on their God. I have one more point, contrasting victims and victors. It's a pretty small one, but I think for some of you, this one is going to be the most important thing that you hear. So number 3, victims live complacent, victors finish the job. Victims live complacent, victors finish the job. We read earlier that Goliath had come and mocked the Israelites for 40 days. And it says he did it morning and evening. So twice a day for 40 days, 80 times, this guy stood up, defied Israel, defied the God of Israel, defied all of these people. And the Israelites did nothing except get more and more fearful of him. And I think David is fascinating because it takes David, we don't know exactly how long, but it seems like all of 5 minutes to decide, I'm done with this guy. If no one else is going to do it, I can't take it any longer. It's been 5 minutes. He's insulting us. Where do I sign up? That's what the victor's response is. So while victims are living complacent for 40 days and just letting all of this mocking and insults seep into them, David can only stand it for about 5 minutes before he says, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to. That's what a victor is like. They finish the job. And I just want to say, church, we can't afford to be complacent. We can't afford to allow things to linger in our lives that we know is just not good for us. We can't allow things to continue living inside of us that are limiting us, restricting us from what God has called us to do. We need to take action. We need to finish the job. We need to take ownership and end it. So once again, number 3, victims live complacent. Victors finish the job. As I close this morning, I want to reiterate the 3 take-home points that I shared last week. Because I think mindsets are important, and that's mostly what we've been talking about. How do we think about victims and victors and the battles in our lives? But I hope to give you some very practical steps to own these mindsets, to own these victor mentalities. So here's how to do that. Number 1 is believe what God says. And actually, I so appreciate what Josh said at the end of worship, just about that still, small voice. Because we need to believe what God says, and God has said tons of stuff in the Bible, and we need to be reading that Bible, absolutely. But we also need to hear God in the still, small voice. And that's what Josh was talking about, is there's so much noise, there's so much chaos. And sometimes we need to turn it all off and just get with God and be quiet. And it's really hard to do, especially in our instant culture where, everything is fast, it feels like. Let's actually just take a moment right now. Let's practice this. Just for 30 seconds or so. Let's just take 30 seconds, quiet your thoughts as best you can. Ask Jesus for help. God, my thoughts are still spinning. Help me. That's a legal prayer. You're allowed to pray that. Now let's just take 30 seconds and let God speak whatever he wants to. Whether it's related to this or something else, that's fine. there's a word that's used in the Psalms, and it's Selah. And I think there's some different opinions about what exactly it means. But generally, the idea is pause in his presence. Wait. Just be quiet and let him speak. Just Selah. I actually feel challenged personally by God in this moment to do this more. Because there's so many things for me that I like doing when it comes to my personal devotions. I love reading my Bible. I love worshiping. I love processing things with Jesus. If there's something on my mind, there is healthy and helpful ways to process things with Jesus. I love praying for people, intercession. But sometimes we just need to be quiet. We need to just let him speak. And I can think of moments in my life when I heard God speak and I wasn't really expecting it. You know, sometimes I'll spend a whole bunch of time in my proverbial prayer closet and not really feel like I've heard anything specific from God. And that's okay. Sometimes that happens. That's not the end of the world. But then I'll just be driving somewhere, driving to the grocery store, and all of a sudden I'll feel God just speak, say something. And I'm grateful that God can get a hold of us in lots of different ways. But it makes me wonder sometimes if he's been waiting to talk until I just was quiet for a little bit. Like, how long have you been trying to get through to me? Oh, we need to rest in his presence and let him speak. If you're still having a moment with God, please ignore me. And I mean that. Stay with Jesus. That's way better than anything that I would say. But number one, to try to make all of these mindsets practical, is to believe what God says. The second one is to find friends, find community, find people that you can walk with, that you can journey with. We were designed to do life together. We were made for community. And it's why we have life groups. We had that announcement. Life groups offer so much. And really, I personally and biblically believe that it's just as important as Sunday mornings. So if you come to church on Sunday mornings, that's great. But we need to be connected to each other, because this is not all there is to Christianity. It's great, and please don't stop coming to church on Sunday mornings. But we need small groups. We need to know each other. We need to connect with each other. We're really passionate about it. We love our life groups, and we want every single person to be connected to them. So find friends who will walk with you on your journey to freedom. And then the third one is just start somewhere. You probably won't have all the answers. You probably won't know all of the things that God will lead you to do. But just start with whatever he leads you to first. Take the first step. And I've lived parts of my life as a victim. I'm sure you have too. And I just want to tell you, there is hope. There is hope. And I still have areas of my life where I'm a victim and I'm still working on it. But I also have areas of my life, and I know that I'm a victor. I know that I have conquered things. I have had breakthrough. I have seen miracles happen in my life. And I've had all these victim mentalities that we talked about and more. But now I can look back at my life, and there are moments that used to hold me captive and totally define much of my season. And they don't hold any power over me now. except to declare the goodness of God and say, like, that was a painful moment, and it doesn't mean anything now except God brought me through that, and I'm good. I don't have that memory with a negative association anymore. I'm free of that. I've overcome that. I once had insecurities and fears that would dictate how I lived and how I walked and how I interacted with people. And I just don't have those anymore. I have new, different ones. No, I'm just kidding, but not really. I do still have fears. I do still have anxieties and insecurities, but I can point to specific ones that I just don't have that anymore. I'm not worried about that anymore. It's not something that is in my brain. And there's relational patterns that are dysfunctional that I used to live in, and I just don't anymore. And I say all of those things not to say, like, I'm amazing. It's because it's all God. And that means that all of that is accessible to every single person here. If you know God, you have access to the victory. Because he wins the victory, right? David had that very concretely in his mind. This battle is God's. I'm here. I volunteered, but it's not really about me. It's about God. God's really good. And God has victory for each and every one of us in every area of our lives. Why don't we stand together?